Have you ever caught yourself editing your own laughter because you worried how it sounded to someone else? Not because the joy wasn't real, but because somewhere along the way you became the manager of your own image, rather than the inhabitant of your own life. You rehearse sentences in your head before saying them. You scan faces for micro-reactions the moment you speak. You choose a path not because it calls to you, but because it looks acceptable when held up against the backdrop of everyone else's expectations. On the surface, nothing looks broken. Yet inside, a quiet exhaustion hums. Not the tiredness that comes from hard work, but the bone-deep weariness of performing yourself. Carl Jung understood this condition intimately. He called it a signal not of failure, but of readiness. A signal that your psyche has spent long enough looking outward for permission and is finally ready to turn back toward its own center. This video is not an escape plan from society. It is not a manual for isolation or indifference. It is a step-by-step journey, a psychological passage from living under the tyranny of the external gaze to cultivating an inner life so solid that you no longer need the world to validate your existence. If the title alone stirred something unnamed in you, that is not coincidence. Perhaps you are being prepared for a different way of being, one where your worth is no longer negotiated. Stay with me until the end, because what you have been chasing out there may be exactly what has been waiting within. 1. The outward mirror. How you handed over your center there is a stage in human development that feels utterly normal. Yet, it is the silent origin of almost every form of inner emptiness. It is the moment you begin to gauge your worth by the glance of another. A compliment inflates your entire day. A lack of response leaves you hollow. A single ambiguous look can unravel your confidence for hours. Life continues outwardly. You work, you talk, you fulfill roles, but inwardly you have relocated your center of gravity to a place outside your own skin. Jung recognized this as the exact point where a person loses their psychological anchor, not because people are cruel, but because the authority to define who you are has been outsourced to something you can never control. You no longer ask, "Does this resonate with me?" But "Will this be approved?" The inner compass is replaced by a radar scanning for social signals. Jung did not condemn this need for recognition as a moral weakness. He viewed it as a developmental necessity, a phase in which the self is still too unformed to sustain its own validation. When you lack a stable inner axis, you are forced to use the environment as a mirror. Not because you are fragile, but because the internal structure is not yet built. As Jung observed, the unlived life often directs us from the shadows, and we mistake its pull for fate. Imagine standing in a hall of mirrors. Everywhere you look, you see a reflection of yourself, but each one is distorted by the glass, slightly taller, thinner, more acceptable. You begin adjusting your posture to match the reflection, then your voice, then your choices. Eventually, you forget that you are the original. You only know the reflections. That is the life lived by the external gaze. You shape-shift endlessly, not to deceive, but to belong. And in that endless adjustment, the quiet tragedy unfolds. You become a faithful replica of what others want, and a stranger to yourself. Jung called this state living by the collective map. You no longer know your own direction. You only know you must not be left behind. Alienation, in his framework, is not about doing something wrong. It is the gradual, almost imperceptible process of drifting away from your own nature while believing you are being appropriate, successful, or good. You choose a career because it is admired. You adopt a lifestyle because it is validated. Each decision seems reasonable. But over time, a hollowness accumulates, a sensation that your life is a rented room. not a home. I once listened to a man in his 40s, a respected architect, who built structures that won awards. He told me he felt no pride, only a quiet dread. He had spent decades designing spaces that impressed clients, but never once asked what kind of space his own soul needed. His inner life had become a neglected blueprint. The external gaze had drafted his entire existence, and now he felt like a visitor in his own biography. This is not a crisis. It is the first whisper of the exiled self. When you live by the external gaze, you adopt a rhythm that is not your own. Jung insisted that each psyche has a unique tempo of maturation. Forcing yourself onto a collective timeline creates a deep subterranean friction. The fatigue, the disorientation, the sense that you are missing your own life, these are not symptoms of laziness. They are the consequences of betraying your inner tempo. Focusing on yourself, from a Jungian view, is not selfishness. It is the deliberate act of retrieving your center from the hands of the crowd. It is the decision to stop asking the world to tell you who you are, and to start asking what has genuine meaning for you, even if no one applauds. The moment you realize you have been living through borrowed eyes, that is not collapse. It is a summons, a very quiet, very persistent call to stop, to return, and to listen to what truly wants to live through you. So let me ask you, when was the last time you made a choice that no one would see, and felt completely at peace with it? If you can't remember, you are not failing, you are simply ready for the next layer. 2. The mask that became the face. The cost of persona. When you first sense that you've been performing your life, a haunting question emerges. Who has been living in my place? Jung's answer is not other people, it is a psychological structure so familiar we rarely name it. The persona. From early childhood, we learn to craft a social mask. It helps us adapt, avoid rejection, and navigate the complex terrain of human belonging. The persona is not a villain. It is a tool. But the catastrophe begins when we forget it is a tool and begin to believe it is our identity. Jung warned that the persona was never designed to carry meaning. It is a functional interface, not a source of inner security. When you try to extract a sense of existence from the mask, a profound misalignment sets in. You no longer live from the inside out. You manage a public image. And the more you defend that image, the further you drift from the authentic. The fear of judgment turns the persona from protection into a prison. At first, you simply want to avoid conflict. You soften your opinions, suppress your emotions, and select a safe path to avoid disappointing anyone. But gradually, you feel forbidden from deviating. Any authentic impulse triggers anxiety, as if the mask has sealed itself over your face. The persona no longer protects you from the world, it protects the world from your truth. Jung wrote that the persona is what we are not, but what we and others think we are. When you fully identify with it, you begin to live for an image rather than for inner coherence. From this, a subtle addiction emerges, the addiction to recognition. You need praise to feel okay. You need positive feedback to trust your direction. Not because you are shallow, but because your sense of worth is invested in the mask, not in the self. I recall a talented musician who was always described as easy to work with. She knew exactly what to say in interviews, what to post, what persona to project. In a private moment, she confessed she no longer knew what music she genuinely loved. Every time she considered a risky, authentic project, a committee of internal voices arose. What will they think? Will they judge me? Is this acceptable? She wasn't living badly, but she had inhabited the persona for so long that the feeling of being real had become foreign. Her anxiety did not come from failure, but from having nowhere left to remove the mask. Focusing on yourself in this context is not about rebellion or abandoning all social roles. It is about learning to distinguish between the persona and the self. It is daring to see that certain aspects of your life exist solely for acceptance, not because they arise from inner necessity. When you begin to loosen the persona even slightly, anxiety surfaces because you are leaving a long, familiar safety zone. But Jung saw that anxiety not as a sign you are wrong, but as proof you are touching something true. Each time you don't perform perfectly, each time you let the mask slip, discomfort arises. Yet alongside that discomfort, something else emerges. A lighter, more alive, more genuine presence. You don't need to destroy the persona overnight. Jung's invitation is simpler. Stop letting the mask govern your inner life. Start listening to your own response before you scan for others. Allow yourself, in small moments, to be unrecognizable to the world in order to preserve inner honesty. From that gradual withdrawal of attention, a quiet rebalancing begins. If, while listening, you sense that you have lived very correctly, but not truly lived, that may not be an accident. I'd like to invite you to leave a comment sharing just a fragment of your own truth. It doesn't need to be polished. Sometimes the act of writing it down is the first moment the mask is set aside. 3. The unseen race. Comparison as self-betrayal. Once you start loosening the persona and no longer live entirely for acceptance, an old reflex instantly fires. You look sideways. You compare. You notice who is moving faster, who has achieved more, who seems to have arrived. And in that glance, according to Jung, you quietly deny your own individual path to enter a race that was never designed for you. Jung asserted that no two psychological development processes are identical. Each person carries a unique unconscious blueprint and a distinct rhythm. Society, however, operates on shared timelines. By a certain age, you should be established. By a certain age, you should be secure. By a certain age, you should have arrived. When you measure your life against those milestones, you stop hearing your inner process and start forcing yourself onto a collective schedule. Jung called this misdirection. Comparison, in the Jungian framework, is not just envy or insecurity. It is a deeper act. You are denying your own individuation. Individuation is the path each person must walk to become themselves, not a successful replica of someone else. Every time you look at others and conclude, "I am behind, I am not enough," you are unconsciously declaring your own journey invalid simply because it doesn't resemble another's. This is a subtle form of self-betrayal. Imagine a runner in a crowded marathon who originally set out to reach his own destination. But hearing the footsteps around him, he accelerates, changes lanes, even veers off course just to avoid looking slow. Eventually, he collapses from exhaustion in a place that was never his finish line. Comparison works exactly like this. When you live inside a race, you spend energy on speed, while what you need most is direction. I spoke with a woman who had spent years feeling she was falling behind her peers. They had the titles, the families, the visible markers of success, while she changed paths repeatedly. Each social gathering left her feeling like a failure. During a period of forced stillness, she realized she had never been lost. She had been walking a completely different terrain, slower in worldly terms, but richer in inner formation. When she stopped comparing and refocused on what held genuine meaning for her, the heaviness lifted, not because she caught up, but because she returned to her own rhythm. Jung once noted that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become yourself if you are constantly measuring your process against other people's lives. Comparison places you on a timeline that doesn't belong to you. It causes you to misjudge necessary phases, slowing down, getting lost, even failing phases that for Jung are often essential to inner maturity. Focusing on yourself at this stage does not mean turning your back on the world. It simply means stopping the use of other people's lives as the yardstick for your own unfolding. It means understanding that not having arrived by collective standards may not be failure. It may mean you are being prepared for a different kind of depth. Forgetting others in the true Jungian sense means forgetting their timelines. It means no longer asking, "Where am I compared to them?" and returning to the far more important question, "Am I aligned with myself?" When you focus on that question, the race dissolves not because you win or lose, but because you realize you were never meant to run in it at all. Ask yourself honestly, is the destination you're sprinting toward even yours? Or did you inherit it from someone else's idea of a good life? Sit with that for a moment. 4. The voice in the shadows. Withdrawing projection after you've stepped out of comparison and begun questioning collective standards. A peculiar thing happens. You are no longer chasing anyone, yet the fear of being judged remains. A glance, a tone, a silence can still unsettle you. According to Jung, this is not a contradiction. It is a sign you have reached a deeper layer, the layer where projection has not yet been reclaimed. Jung taught that most of our obsession with being judged does not originate in the external world. It arises from unacknowledged aspects of our own inner life. He called this projection the unconscious act of attributing inner material to other people. When a feeling or self-image is too difficult to accept, the psyche assigns it to someone else. We then believe they are thinking about us, judging us, when in reality we are hearing the voice of our own shadow. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The fear of judgment operates through the same mechanism. You may believe others are harsh towards you, but look closely. Who is it that does not allow you to make mistakes? Who constantly whispers that you are not good enough, not fast enough, not correct enough? Very often it is not a person outside, but a part of you, the repressed, denied aspect of the psyche. When the shadow is not acknowledged, it doesn't disappear. It seeps into how you interpret the world. I recall a teacher who was convinced her colleagues disrespected her. She felt every question carried doubt. Every piece of feedback was criticism. When she began deep inner work, she discovered a belief she had never voiced. I am not competent enough. That belief had been running silently for decades. Because she couldn't face it as something needing healing, she projected it outward and believed others were thinking it for her. When she finally confronted her own self-doubt, something strange happened. The outside world seemed less judgmental, not because people changed, but because she withdrew the projection. Modern cognitive psychology aligns with this. Research shows the brain interprets ambiguous information according to pre-existing beliefs. If you carry an internal schema of "I am easily judged," you become hypersensitive to looks and tones, and your brain automatically fills in the gaps with negative interpretations. Jung saw this long before the labs confirmed it. The world you fear often mirrors what you have not yet dared to face within yourself. When you begin to integrate the shadow, allowing yourself to see and dialogue with the disowned parts, a crucial shift occurs. External voices lose their power, not because you become indifferent, but because you no longer need others to carry your unresolved inner conflicts. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can face disagreement without feeling threatened because you have taken full responsibility for your inner world. Focusing on yourself at this level is the act of reclaiming the psychological energy you have unconsciously given to the world. Each time you worry about being judged, that energy flows outward. When you turn inward and ask, which part of me is saying this? You bring that energy back home. Jung saw this as the transition from living in reaction to the world to living in dialogue with oneself. Forgetting others here does not mean denying their existence. It means stopping the use of them as mirrors for your own unhealed fragments. When you no longer need the world to carry what you have not yet accepted, the world becomes more neutral, less threatening. And in that quiet, a new kind of freedom emerges. You stop asking, who is judging me? And start asking, what within me wants to be seen? The moment you dare to stay with that question, you take a deep step on the journey back to yourself. If in the silence that follows you realize you no longer want to ask who is looking at you, but instead begin to wonder what inside you is being reflected, leave a single word in the comments. Mirror. Sometimes just naming it is enough to start shifting the entire dynamic. 5. The solitude you avoid is the self you need once you stop believing that all eyes are fixed on you. Life undergoes a strange deceleration. The mental noise that once crowded your mind begins to recede. And in that settling stillness, a familiar but long-avoided state surfaces: solitude. According to Jung, this is not regression. It is a sign you are approaching your inner center. Jung viewed solitude radically differently from the common fear. For him, solitude did not mean abandonment, lack, or social failure. Solitude is the sacred space where the soul can finally speak, without being drowned out. He once wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. When you have lived too long under the gaze of others, you rarely hear what is important to yourself. Therefore, withdrawing from the crowd is not escape. It is the necessary condition for inner truth to become audible. When you are constantly reacting to the opinions, expectations, and emotions of others, the self has no room to coordinate your existence. You may function efficiently, integrate well, and look successful, but inside there remains a quiet chamber that has never been entered. And precisely because we fear that chamber, we often cling to busyness and constant interaction as a way to avoid it. Imagine solitude as a deep lake at dawn. When the wind blows, the surface is endlessly rippled, reflecting distorted, fragmented images. Only when the wind dies does the surface become still, and the true image beneath emerges. Psychological life is no different. Surrounded by voices, you see only fleeting reflections. But when you dare to be alone, truly alone, without reacting, deeper layers of yourself begin to appear. Silence does not create your true voice. It simply allows it to be heard. Think of the period when the painter Georgia O'Keeffe retreated to the New Mexico desert. Outwardly, it looked like isolation. Inwardly, it was a profound homecoming. Away from the noise of critics and urban art circles, she began to paint from a place of inner necessity, vast, unmistakable, authentic. Jungian psychology sees such withdrawals not as weakness but as the self's way of restructuring. What makes many people terrified of solitude is not being alone itself, but what will surface when there is no one left to distract them. In that quiet, the questions you have avoided arrive. True desires, unnamed grief, and the inner conflicts once covered by social life demand attention. Jung considered this necessary, because only when you dare to stay with these contents do you have the chance to integrate them, rather than continuing to project them outward. Focusing on yourself does not mean cutting off relationships. It means temporarily withdrawing your attention from the external in order to re-establish inner order. You don't need to vanish into a cave, but you do need periods of silence deep enough that you are no longer tugged by comparison or judgment. When you are alone without trying to fill the time, you give the self the space to coordinate your life again. Forgetting others here is not antisocial. It is the only way back to center. When you no longer need others to validate you or serve as a backdrop for your identity, you begin to stand more firmly in interaction. You don't cling, overreact, or lose yourself in relationships. True solitude does not distance you from people. It allows you to be more fully present when you return to them. When you can sit in silence without panic. When you can be alone without feeling lack. That is a sign the self has begun to take its rightful place in your life. And from that inner foundation you re-enter the world not to seek but to live. Not to be seen, but to be present. Not to chase anyone, but to walk in alignment with the deepest rhythm of yourself. 6. The inner citadel. From extroverted ego to disciplined inner life, there comes a profound turning point. Jung saw it as a threshold when a person stops being pulled outward by the world and, for the first time, begins to build a disciplined inner life. Not the discipline of force, achievement, or proving, but a discipline born from an urgent inner necessity. Jung distinguished carefully between action driven by the extroverted ego and action rooted in the inner core. When the extroverted ego leads, you act to be seen, recognized, favorably compared. Your life's rhythm becomes dictated by external feedback, but when action arises from inner necessity, you act because something inside demands to be realized, even if no one sees, no one praises, and no one understands. Jung said that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no universal recipe for living. True discipline cannot be borrowed. It emerges only when you listen to your own rhythm. Imagine a disciplined inner life as a tree with roots growing deep underground. The roots are invisible, unimpressive to the passerby. Yet they determine whether the tree withstands storms. If you only focus on shaping the canopy to look good, the tree appears fine until the first strong wind. Jungian discipline is not about making your life's canopy more impressive. It is about returning daily to nourish those invisible roots in silence. I met a researcher named Elias, who had spent years chasing publications and prestige. After a collapse, he didn't launch into a dramatic overhaul. Instead, he began doing something almost invisible, waking a little earlier to read something that genuinely moved him, writing a few lines of honest reflection, and completing one small, meaningful task each day without telling a soul. No one praised him. No one knew. Yet he noticed he was calmer, clearer, less swayed by departmental politics. He didn't become better than his colleagues. He became more aligned with himself. From that inner anchor, external effectiveness followed as a consequence. Modern research on intrinsic motivation supports this. When action is tied to personal meaning and inner coherence, the nervous system maintains a more stable focus. Extrinsic motivation rewards, surveillance, evaluation quickly fatigues the brain. Jung described this in the language of psychic energy. Energy flows long-term only when it serves the process of becoming oneself. Focusing on yourself at this stage means establishing a new order of priorities. You invest in yourself not to surpass others, but to avoid betraying what you know to be true for you. You might do less than others, move slower than others, but each step carries weight. This discipline is often lonely because it doesn't produce a compelling story. There are no immediate achievements, no applause, and precisely because of that, it remains undisturbed. True growth, from Jung's perspective, is almost always silent. It doesn't resemble a breakthrough. It resembles a quiet, steady accumulation. Each day you choose to do what is necessary without being pushed. Each time you keep a promise to yourself in a very small matter, you strengthen and when that center solidifies, you act in the world without being dragged by it. You don't need to force effort because the energy is already there. You don't need to prove because the direction is already clear. And it is precisely then that you realize the Jungian paradox. The more deeply you focus on yourself, the more steadily you are present in life. Quiet, unshowy, but with real weight. This is the discipline no one sees, yet it holds your entire life together. If these words land in you not like an explosion, but like a deep, calm recognition, like a note struck on a piano that resonates in your chest press like on this video, not as an external reaction, but as a small, silent sign that you are choosing to listen to something very real inside. Sometimes even such a gesture is a form of inner discipline. 7. The energy you take back. Stop seeking validation. So what happens when you have built a disciplined inner life, yet a subtle part of you still waits for the world to respond? You are no longer chaotic, no longer comparing, no longer reacting blindly. But somewhere inside remains a delicate movement, the wish to be acknowledged, to be seen, to receive some confirmation that you are on the right path. According to Jung, this is not a failure of the inward journey. It is the next stage of ego maturation, the moment when energy truly begins to withdraw from the world. An immature ego needs constant reflection to know it exists. Praise, attention, and feedback serve as mirrors through which the ego takes shape. But the ego is not meant to remain there. As it matures, it no longer requires the world to continually tell it that it is okay. It begins to stand on a different foundation, inner unity. At this point, value no longer comes from what you have, how many recognize you, or where you rank. It comes from a deep inner sense that what you live, think, and do are not in conflict with one another. Many confuse focusing on yourself with egoism or cold withdrawal. From a Jungian perspective, withdrawing energy from the world is not turning away from others, it is stopping the use of them as the source of your worth. When you still need validation, a portion of your psychic energy is still flowing outward, waiting to be returned in the form of approval. And as a result, your emotional life remains externally regulated, even if you look independent on the surface. I once worked with a writer named Sam, who had moved beyond comparison and was no longer crippled by judgment. He had a relatively solid inner life, wrote daily, and didn't chase an image. Yet whenever he published something personal, he still unconsciously checked for reactions. Not because he was weak, but because a part of him was still asking, is this good enough to be seen? When he noticed that subtle movement and stopped not by forcing indifference, but by returning to the inner feeling of writing itself, a quiet shift occurred. He no longer rose and fell with responses. The work remained the same, but his emotions were lighter. He didn't lose motivation, he lost dependence. Jung once noted that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. To fully accept yourself means you no longer need anyone else to bear witness to your value. This is frightening for an immature ego accustomed to being fed by feedback. But for an ego that has passed through enough experience, this becomes liberation. You no longer need to prove, because there is no part inside demanding reassurance. Imagine psychic energy as an underground river. When you constantly seek validation, that river branches into 1,000 shallow streams, each one vulnerable to drought. When you withdraw the energy, the river does not vanish. It seeps deep into the aquifer, nourishing roots far below the surface. No one sees the water underground, but it determines whether the tree survives. Inner value, it doesn't need to be displayed, but when it is deep enough, all outward action becomes stable. Emotional independence in Jungian psychology does not mean needing no one. It means not being shaken by whether others respond or not. When the self begins to coordinate life, your emotions no longer rise and fall with external gazes. You can receive praise without excessive excitement, and criticism without collapse, not because you are numb, but because the center of regulation has moved from outside to inside. Focusing on yourself now is no longer an effort. It becomes a natural state. You don't need to try to forget others, because when energy has been withdrawn inward, others naturally lose their grip. You aren't concerned with proving you are right, nor do you need anyone to confirm you are on the right path. You know not intellectually, but through a deep, bodily sense of inner coherence. This is a very particular moment of psychological maturity, when you realize you are no longer living to be seen, not to be recognized, but simply to avoid betraying what you know to be true. The world is still there, people are still there, but they no longer hold authority over your inner life. And in that very quiet withdrawal, a rare form of freedom appears, a freedom that does not need to oppose anyone or surpass anyone, because you are no longer standing on the same axis of measurement. Conclusion. The quiet return. When you reach this point, you may realize that focusing on yourself was never an act of rebellion or cold withdrawal. It was a very quiet return, a silent shifting of the center of living from outside to inside, no longer needing the world to confirm who you are, no longer requiring others' gazes as proof of your value. You begin to stand on a different foundation, inner coherence. From that point, life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes truer. You no longer have to live fast to keep up with anyone, live correctly to be accepted, or live big to be seen. You only need to live in alignment with what is moving most deeply within you. And paradoxically, it is precisely when you stop seeking your place in the world that the world no longer has the power to shake you. If this video has made you pause, if it has touched a familiar, unnamed feeling you have carried for a long time, share it with someone who is also tired of living under the gaze of others. And if you wish to continue the journey into inner life, subscribe to the channel and walk with us. Not to become a better version for the world, but to no longer lose yourself within it. The path inward is not a retreat. It is the most courageous act you can undertake. And it begins the moment you stop asking for directions from those who